Presbyter King coming to you once again from Nugget of Truth and the Shepherd's Way. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of ancient Antioch. As you know, we are the ancient Antiochian Church here of God here in America, and it's important to look at where we came from. We were first called Christians in Antioch, Acts 11 verse 26. We've covered in previous lectures, those of you that have been studying with us here, some pretty controversial historical truths about the ancient religious environment of Jesus' time. We had the Essenes, different factions of the Essenes, and we have the Nazarenes and different factions of the Nazarenes. And from both of those, in their prophecies, in their intense study of prophecy, they were not seen as like a denomination as seen today. They were more seen as a movement of Israelites, specifically Nazarenes protecting the bloodline of Judah, through which Mashiach, Jesus, would be born through. And so it was that Nazarene sect that protected with their lives the line of David, the genealogical line of David, which was meticulously recorded both in Joseph's and in Mary's genealogical line. The Essenian groups, on the other hand, when we talk about them, they're down all the way by the Dead Sea region. And the Essenes were an esoteric, prophetic monastery group that included women in their group and even married couples in their group. They had different levels of dedication and understanding. We've covered some of their history. There was a schism that occurred in that ancient Essenian organization that God was using. And we cover this in other deeper lectures that I would invite you to watch here, be that as it may. But a faction of the Essenes broke off, and they traveled all the way up to Jordan, and in doing so, set up encampments along the Jordan all the way till they get up through and into, ultimately outside of Palestine, outside of Upper Galilee, and they begin to reside in Damascus. And by the time of Jesus Christ, there had been an Essenian missionary group there, a prophetic messianic group there, which contained predominantly both Jews and mixed Jews, Hellenized Jews, Greek Jews, and they were very intense in their studies, and it contained a very diverse and a more liberal. They were more liberal in their understanding to some extent. But upon arriving there, they were there when Paul arrives there. Also, we have to understand that in this same Damascus region, a lot of from the Nazarean sect, the group that God had been protecting, in the Old Testament, there were many that took the Nazarite vows that had protected this knowledge, and the more Jewish or Hebraic Jewish term of that time for those that separated themselves from the main religious groups of that time, talking about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, them coming together forming the Sanhedrin. Those groups, the Pharisees and Sadducees, the Essenes would come into town, they would shop, they would minister, they would do things, they would try to proselyte if possible. But they spent the majority of their time, the original Essenes, up there near that Dead Sea region. But the ones that broke away, they, as I said, they were in Damascus, and they would come into Galilee. They would come into Galilee, and they had much more influence of Gentiles. The Gentiles up there in upper northern Galilee was predominantly all Gentile. When I say Gentile there, I mean the low class. I'm talking a lot of poor regions there that were not Greek in the sense of Gentiles in the classical Greek sense of the term as far as their culture and religion, but we're talking about Gentile pagans that were in, a lot of them in upper northern Galilee, specifically connected to the Antiochean region. And we talk about Antioch there, I've called it Lower Turkey. There is an Antioch up in Turkey. It's a different Antioch that was also reached and witnessed in the early church. But the Antioch that we refer to, where we were first called Christians, is right along the Mediterranean Sea there, and quite frankly, the capital of Syria is Antioch. But it was 150,000 people that resided there from every kindred, nation, tribe, and tongue. It's multicultural. It was multilinguistic. There was many languages being spoken there, predominantly dirty dirty Greek and dirty Latin was spoke there, and Hebrew and Aramaic was also shared there. Now, you got to remember that 90% of Jesus' ministry occurred in Galilee. I mean, most of Jesus' ministry, when we read in the New Testament, occurred there in Galilee. A lot of things occurred there. And of course, Jesus being raised in Galilee, he was a Nazarite or a Nazarene. Again, the Jews would call anybody that separated themselves in some of these offshoot rogue groups they considered, they would just, the Sanhedrin and Sadducees would say, oh, they took some kind of Nazarite vow, they're a Nazarite. But the more Hellenistic term for them was the word Nazarene, which is a play on the word Netzer, which means branch, and we did other studies on that because they emphasized messianic prophecies, specifically 4 major prophecies dealing with the branch, which was a messianic title. And so because they spoke a lot about that, and they were very esoteric and eschatological in their theology, they were seen as kind of, they were questionable if they were really honest or whatever, something was wrong. So they were just grouped into these groups. Oh yeah, those Nazarites, oh those Nazareans, oh yeah, those Essenes, yeah. However, when we get to John the Baptist, and not to say that they weren't respected by some of the Pharisees and Sadducees, because when they did come in, they were quite, they knew the scriptures. They were very familiar with the scriptures, specifically the post and pre-exilic prophets. And so they were, sometimes the Pharisees, when they would hear them talk, they would kind of back off of them a little bit because they admitted in their hearts, they knew they didn't know the scriptures like the Nazareans and Essenes did. And quite frankly, and I always say this, and it's important to understand this, this is why God was using these outside religious movements that were studying Scripture, that were studying the Scriptures, instead of the organized denominations of Phariseeism and Sadduceeism. And see, the Pharisees, they were sad, you see, and the Pharisees, they just weren't fair, you see. So they were doing their own thing. And so God called the people who kind of had separated themselves from that. They would come in and partake in some of the religious festivities and stuff, and proselyte and talk about the scriptures. But then the Essenes and Nazarenes would kind of back off. Now we also have to realize there was another influence in the Essenian group that was down by the Dead Sea region, and that over a long period of time, that was a group that came up from Egypt, and that was the Therapeutai, or the Therapeutai was another group that some of them had been proselyted into Judaism. So you had Greek proselytes, and you also had Egyptian proselytes. And the Dead Sea region dealt with it a little bit, but they were very conservative, and so a lot of them, and there was a schism that broke out there, and a lot of them, as I said, eventually left and exodused up the Jordan, up into the Damascus region. So by the time we get to the Christian era, the Essenes that had been in Damascus, and we call those the Christian Essenes, those are the ones that we accept, those are the ones that became part of where we originally came from, the Nazarean sect. Those are the ones that actually joined with the Nazarean sect under John the Baptist. And then those Essenes and the ancient Nazarenes, the 1st century Nazarenes of Jesus' time, not the 2nd and 3rd century Nazarenes, no. They had problems and issues, but those first century Nazarenes early on, during the time of right after Christ and before Christ, and the Essenians, the Damascus Essenians, are the two movements that actually became the Christian movement, because they joined John the Baptist. And what was John doing? He was preparing the way. And by so doing, the spiritual movement became, those that followed it became known as followers of the way. And both a prophecy of the way shower appears in the Nazarene prophecies and also appears in the Essenian prophecies. In other words, they had been prophesying for a century about the messianic figure that was to appear. Actually, 2 messianic figures, and we have other studies on that, be that as it may. But in this study, we'll cover the fact that in ancient Antioch, and it has a connection with the early Essenians and the early Nazarites, and that's important to understand. We also have to understand that in the dispersion of the original church at Jerusalem, during the troubles ensuing on the bold action of Stephen, when Stephen was stoned, after the Christian church was started there, sometime shortly after 30 AD, Stephen goes in, and what does he do? He starts speaking the word of God and prophesying. And the Pharisees and Sadducees, quite frankly, don't like what they're hearing, so they stone him to death. And that was in Jerusalem. So we have an exodus of Christians leaving Jerusalem after that persecution. And where did they go? Many of them went to Cyprus, and some of them went to Cyrene. Of course, Cyprus is the island there off the Mediterranean. Cyrene is down in Upper Egypt area. So these were Jews that were proselyted these were Gentile Jews, mind you, that were proselyted into Judaism that had become Christians. So a lot of them run back to the areas where they originally came from when the persecution of Christianity occurred in Jerusalem, or in early Jerusalem. Paul being part of that persecution, Paul being there under the name Saul when they persecuted Stephen and stoned Stephen, and that was before Paul's conversion. Here, Paul being a Pharisee, goes there and he kills the Christians there in Jerusalem, including Stephen, and then he gets an edict on his way to Damascus, where we were just talking about, where a lot of the Antiochene and Galilean Nazarenes and Damascus Essenes hung out, and they were fleeing to that region. They were fleeing back to Cyrene and Cyprus at the same time, and these were Greek Jewish communities who had a different perspective, worldview perspective than the Jews in literal Israel and in Israel there in Jerusalem. These Hellenized Jews had a slightly different, because they were influenced by Aristotle, by Plato, by their philosophies, which affected their understanding of theology. I've done other studies on this too. If you watch my lectures I gave on ancient Alexandrian and Antiochene theology, you'll see how the Greek influence, God used the Greek influence in New Testament theology so that we could understand theology. As a matter of fact, one of the famous patristic fathers likened Greek philosophy as how Paul likened the Torah. Paul says to the Church of Galatians, Apostle Paul, after his conversion, he says that the law, the Torah, the 613 laws of the Torah were our tutor. They were a schoolmaster that pointed us to a better religious experience, a better spiritual understanding through Yeshua HaMashiach. He says, so the old stuff was a tutor, shadows and types pointing us to a greater reality, to the divine matrix, if you will. And so we would say the same thing here in the ancient Antiochene school, because that we would say that the Greek philosophy, God was prepping the minds of the elect so that they would receive a deeper understanding of Jesus Christos and the gospel message. So Antioch is intimately connected with the early history of the gospel. We know that they resided in Antioch, and the Gentile church grew there, and that's where Paul systematically organized his missionary journeys. And after the first one returning back to Antioch, after the other one returning back to Antioch as a hub, as a base, ancient Antioch. And we also have been giving our talks on the New Testament, where we show that actually there was after 49 and 50 AD, right there going into 50 AD, coming out of 49 AD, after the Council of Jerusalem, we've also covered the fact that in Antioch it was decided that the Gospels be rewritten, and the four Gospels were decided on. And of course, we know that the first earliest writings go all the way back to, organized writings go back to 45 AD, starting with Mark's Gospel. But we know that after that Jerusalem Council there, they decided to put those Gospels together there in Antioch. So we know that Matthew, John, and Mark were the first ones done, probably right before 53 AD. Up into 53 AD, they were completed. They had been done and circulating. We also know in the Dead Sea region, they actually found a copy, portions of the Gospel of Mark that date back to exactly 50 AD, showing that what we teach here can also be archaeologically documented. Be that as it may. My point is that in Antioch also the Gospels were written. Of course, Luke's not being added till uh, 53, 54, 55 AD, between 54 and 55 AD. Of course, Luke traveled with Paul, so he was doing a lot of his writing and completing his gospel in his journey with Paul. And we can say that all four of them were finally completed on right before probably Paul's third missionary journey out of Antioch. And we've documented that, and we have that in other studies. So in this talk that I hope that you kind of took some notes, I kind of danced around here with some of the ancient history that we're studying, and I hope that that kind of fills in gaps. This little lecture here was kind of to give you little tidbits here and there to help paint the picture. You know, we're painting a picture. It's like when you're putting a puzzle together, you got all these pieces. You may get one little piece here and you start to see, oh, okay, another piece here, you still got a gap here, and then all of a sudden, oh, there's how it comes there. And so that's kind of what these lectures do. My motive is to get to spark in you the motive and the energy to do your own research in your own theological studies into God's Word. I want you to get into God's Word and God's Word to get into you. Again, I don't teach the Scriptures. I let the Scriptures teach us. I pray that that's the motto of every Christian here that studies with us. Keep your Bibles with you at all times. Talk to you soon.